Strange and the spooky, adventurous and loony, they're all together ooky, the Bud family. Their trips are amazing when people come to see 'em. They really are amazing, the Bud family. History, ghost, art. So put on a witch's shawl on, a seat so you can relax on. We're gonna play a call on the Bud family. Good morning to all of you peoples. It is Wednesday, and we are having a Wayback Wednesday. But this Wayback Wednesday does not happen today or tomorrow, which is usually when we do our current history, unless it's random and Joe decides something off topic. But this is one that I sort of selected. I had it penciled into my calendar, but it doesn't happen until Sunday, which is 3 days from now. 11, 12, 13. Saturday? Is that Saturday? Friday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So, yeah, Saturday. I know how to tell time. I could look at the calendar, but I didn't. On Saturday, we may have a special live if things don't change between now and then. You know, us and the P word don't go very well. So keep an eye out for that. If you've been with our channel a couple of years, you know what Saturday is. If you don't, maybe you should look it up. Not on the Google history, on our channel. Anyway, before Saturday and Friday and all of that, we have a race today. You're all going to be witches. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time is a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. Hold on. All right. Come on. There we go. We got a flying soccer ball for reasons. We've got She Stole, Cruising Nuts, Nikki and Happy, Zol. Let's see. There's Onya. There's Cherry. There's Ron. There's M&J. There's Richard. There's Gloria. There's TNT. Let's see. There is Debbie. There's Chris. There's Crystal. There's Gloria. There's Goat. There's Abundance. There's Northern. There's Sheep. There's my Linda. There's Susan. There's Mark. And hold on a minute. All right, let's try this again. Alrighty. There we go. Come on. Come on. Come on. There we go. That's a nice slow today. Alright, there we go. No, wow, we're going really slow today. I might have to restart our replay. Oh dear, hang on a minute. Alright, let's try this again. See if it'll time out again, or if it'll go uber duper slow. It is gonna go uber duper slow. Alright. Alright, let's try this again. There we go, that's much better. Okay, so we got She Stole. We got Bluegrass, there's Brad, there's Sophia, there's Jersey, there's Harking Ontario, 755, I see John P, I see Jamaican, Susie, We Go, Bubba, Crazy, Jericho, Pete, AMG, there's Chris, there's Amboys, I see Bubba, I see Tates, I see Ohio, I see Wit, I see Rowdy, I see Distracted, I see Cliffa, I see Keep Digging, I see Debbie, there's Susan, there's Reef, Reef's taking over, there's Richard, Frugal, oh, it's gonna be Reef. Alright, this is the Reef Rubber. Mr. Reef is a channel about the ocean fishing. He loves being on the ocean and fishing. It is a popular topic. He loves outdoors. Oh, that's not what I meant to do, and that's not what I meant to do. And as you can see, very popular dude. He's at 27. Wow, I didn't realize you were so big. Anyway, you see a lot of ocean thingies. We got fish, we got crabbing, we got some shorts here. So this is basically a seaman, which is sort of funny, because today's topic is about the water. Not fishing. Another water activity. Hope you enjoy. Alright. Go ahead, tell them something.
Okay, well, yes.
We'll pretend it's interesting.
Well, pretend that it's interesting, or I'll just put you to sleep. You get your blankies and your teddy bears.
Yummy binky.
Binky. History. United States Navy. Our boys in the water, not the Marines. Basically comes into two periods. The old Navy, a small and respected force of sailing ships that became notable for the innovation, the use of the ironclads during the Civil War, and the new Navy, the result of a modernization effort that began in the 1880s and made the largest in the world by 1943. Now, United States claims October 13th, 1775, as the date of its official establishment, when the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution creating the Continental Navy. With the end of the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Navy was disbanded. Now, under the presidency of George Washington, merchant shipping came under threat while in the Mediterranean by Barbary pirates from 4 North African states. This led to the Naval Act of 1794, which created a permanent standing U.S. Navy. Now, the original 6 frigates were authorized as part of this act, and over the next 20 years, the Navy fought the French Republic Navy in the Quasi-War, Barbary states in the First and Second Barbary Wars, and the British in the War of 1812. So after the War of 1812, the Navy was at peace until the Mexican-American War in 1846, and served to combat piracy in the Mediterranean and Caribbean seas, as well as fighting the slave trade off the coast of West Africa. In 1845, the Naval Academy was founded at the old Fort Sumner in Annapolis, Maryland, by the Chesapeake Bay. In 1861, the American Civil War began, and the U.S. Navy fought the small Confederate States Navy with both sailing ships and the new Revolutionary ironclad ships, forming a blockade that shut down the Confederacy's civilian coastal shipping. Well, after the Civil War, most of its ships were laid up in reserve, and by 1878, the Navy was down to just 6,000 men.
Uh-oh.
Well, in 1882, the U.S. Navy consisted of many outdated ship designs, and over the next decade, Congress approved building multiple modern steel-hulled armored cruisers and battleships, and around the start of the 20th century had moved from 12th place in 1870 to 5th place in terms of numbers of ships. Most sailors, interesting enough, were foreigners. After winning 2 major battles in the 1898 Spanish-American War, the American Navy continued to build more ships, and by the end of World War I, had more men and women in uniform than the British Royal Navy. Well, the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 recognized the Navy as equal in capital ship size to the Royal Navy, and during the 1920s and 30s, the Navy built several aircraft carriers and battleships. Well, the Navy got drawn into World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, and over the next 4 years fought many historic battles, including the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, multiple naval battles during the Guadalcanal campaigns, and the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Much of the Navy's activity concentrated on the supportive landings, not only with the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, but also with European landings. When the Japanese surrendered, a large flotilla entered Tokyo Bay to witness the formal ceremony conducted on the battleship Missouri, on which the officials from the Japanese government signed the Japanese Instrument of Surrender. By the end of the war, the Navy had over 1,600 warships. Well, after World War II ended, the United States Navy entered the 45-year-long Cold War that participated in the Korean and Vietnam proxy wars. Nuclear power and ballistic and guided missile technology led to new ship propulsion and weapons systems, which were used in the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and Ohio-class submarines. By 1978, the number of ships had dwindled to less than 400, many of which were from World War II, which prompted Ronald Reagan to institute a program for a modern 600-ship Navy. Following the collapse of Russia, of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy was divided among the former Soviet republics and was left without funding, which made the United States the world's undisputed naval superpower, with the ability to engage and project power in two simultaneous limited wars along separate fronts. This ability was demonstrated during the First and Second Persian Gulf Wars. Well, in March of 2007, the U.S. Navy reached its smallest size with 274 ships since World War I. Former U.S. Navy admirals who head the U.S. Naval Institute have raised concerns about what they see as an inability to respond to aggressive moves by Iran and China. The United States Navy has overtaken by the Chinese People's Liberation Army and Navy in terms of raw numbers of ships in 2020. Now, back to the original good old days, the Continental Navy. Back when they had the original resolution, it stated, resolved that a swift sailing vessel to carry 10 carriage guns and a proportionate number of swivels with 80 men be fitted with all possible dispatch for a cruise of 3 months, and that the commander be instructed to cruise eastward for intercepting such transports that may be laden with warlike stores and other supplies for our enemies, and for such other purposes as the Congress shall direct. That a committee of 3 be appointed to prepare an estimate for the expense and lay the same before Congress, and to contract the proper persons to fit out the vessel. Resolved that another vessel be fitted out for the same purposes, and that the said committee report their opinion on a proper vessel and also estimate of the expense. This is the resolution of the Continental Congress marked for the establishment of what is now the U.S. Navy. Now, the Navy was rooted in the American seafaring tradition, which produced a large community of sailors, captains, and shipbuilders during the colonial era. During the Revolution, several states operated their own navies. June 12, 1775, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a resolution creating a navy for the colony of Rhode Island. The same day, Governor Nicholas Cook signed orders addressed to Captain Abraham Whipple, commander of the sloop Katy, and the commodore of the armed vessels employed by the government. The first formal movement for the creation of the Continental Navy again came from Rhode Island, because the widespread smuggling activities of Rhode Island merchants had been increasingly suppressed by the British Royal Navy. How dare the British stop us? On August 26, 1775, Rhode Island passed a resolution that there would be a single continental fleet funded by the Continental Congress. The resolution was introduced in the Continental Congress on October 3rd in 1775, but it was tabled. In the meantime, George Washington had begun to acquire ships, starting with the schooner USS Hannah, that was paid out of Washington's own pocket. I got a schooner. Hannah was commissioned and launched on September the 5th, 1775, under the command of Captain Nicholas Barkton from the port of Marblehead, Massachusetts. Well, the United States Navy recognizes October the 13th, 1775, as the date of its official establishment, the date of the passage of the resolution of the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that created the Continental Navy. On this day, Congress authorized the purchase of 2 vessels to be armed for a privateering cruise against British merchant shipping. On December the 13th, 1775, Congress authorized the building of 13 frigates within the next 3 months, 5 ships of 32 guns and 5 with 28 guns, and 3 with 24 guns. That's a lot of guns.
A lot of guns.
Now, on Lake Champlain, Benedict Arnold ordered the construction of 12 naval vessels to slow down the progress of British forces which had entered the New York from Canada. In the ensuing engagement, the Royal Navy decisively defeated Arnold's ships after 2 days of fighting, but the battle managed to slow down the progression of British ground forces in New York. By mid-1776, the number of ships ranging up to and including 13 frigates approved by Congress, were under construction, but their effectiveness was limited. They were completely outmatched by the Royal Navy, and nearly all were captured or sunk by 1781.
Oops.
American privateers had some success, with 1,697 letters of marque issued by Congress. Individual states, American agents in Europe and the Caribbean also issued commissions. Taking duplications into account, for more than 2,000 commissions were issued by various sources. Over 2,200 British merchant ships were captured by American privateers during the war, amounting to almost $66 million.
Wow.
A significant sum at that time. Now, one particular notable American naval officer of the time was John Paul Jones, who, a voyage around the British Isles, captured the Royal Navy frigate Serpius in the Battle of Flamborough Head. Partway through the battle, with the rigging of two ships entangled, several guns of Jones' ship Bonhomme Richard out of action, the captain of Serapis asked Jones if he had struck his colors, to which Jones was quoted replying, "I have not yet begun to fight." France officially entered the war on June 17th, 1778, and the ships of the French Navy sent to the Western Hemisphere spent most of the year in the West Indies, and only sailed near the 13 colonies during the Caribbean hurricane that season, from July until November. Gee, why would you want to play in a hurricane?
Fun. Weren't you paying attention?
No, they're tons of fun, especially right now. The French Navy fleet attempted landings in New York and Rhode Island in 1778, but ultimately failed to engage the British forces. In 1779, a fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Charles Henry, Comte d'Estaing, assisted American forces attempting to recapture Savannah, Georgia. In 1780, a fleet with 6,000 troops, commanded by Lieutenant General Jean-Baptiste Comte de Rochambeau, landed at Newport, Rhode Island, and shortly thereafter the fleet was blockaded by the Royal Navy. Early 1781, Washington and de Rochambeau planned an attack against the British in the Chesapeake Bay area to coordinate with the arrival of the large fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Francois Comte de Grasse. Successfully deceiving the British that an attack was planned in New York, Washington and de Rochambeau marched to Virginia, and de Grasse began landing forces near Yorktown, Virginia. Hi, guys!
Hi.
On September the 5th, 1781, a major naval action was fought by de Grasse and the British at the Battle of the Virginia Capes, ending with the French fleet in control of the Chesapeake Bay. The Continental Navy continued to interdict the British supply ships until peace was finally declared in late 1783. Well, after the Revolutionary War ended, with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, by 1785 the Continental Navy was disbanded and the remaining ships were sold off. The frigate Alliance, which had fired the last shots of the American Revolutionary War, was also the last ship of the Navy. A faction within Congress wanted to keep the ship, but the new nation did not have the funds to keep her in service. Other than a general lack of money, factors in the disarmament of the Navy were the loose confederation of states, a change of goals from war to peace, and more domestic and fewer foreign interests. After the Revolutionary War, the brand new United States struggled to stay financially afloat. We've mentioned this before. They were having real budgetary issues. National income was in desperate need, and most came from tariffs on imported goods. Because of rampant smuggling, the need was immediate for a strong enforcement of tariff laws. On August 4th, 1790, the United States Congress, urged on by Alexander Hamilton, created the Revenue Marine, a forerunner of the United States Coast Guard, to enforce the tariff and other maritime laws. 10 cutters were originally ordered, and between 1790 and 1797, when the Navy Department was created, the Revenue Marine was the only armed maritime service for the United States. Now, American merchant shipping had been protected by the Royal Navy during the colonial era, but as a consequence of the Treaty of Paris and the disarmament of the Continental Navy, the United States no longer had any protection for its ships from pirates. The fledgling nation did not have the funds to pay annual tribute to the Barbary States, so their ships were vulnerable for capture after 1785. By 1789, the Constitution of the United States authorized Congress to create a navy, but George Washington's first term, little was done to rearm the Navy. 1783, the French Revolutionary Wars between Great Britain and France began, and a truce negotiated between Portugal and Algiers ended Portugal's blockade of the Strait of Gibraltar, which had kept the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. Soon after, the pirates sailed into the Atlantic and captured 11 American merchant ships and more than 100 seamen. In reaction to the seizure, Congress debated and approved the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the building of 6 frigates, 4 with 44 guns and 2 with 36 guns. Supporters were mostly from the northern states and the coastal regions, who argued the Navy would result in savings in insurance and ransom payments, while opponents from southern states and inland regions thought a Navy was not worth the experience and would drive the United States into more costly wars. I can see both sides. Now, after the passage of the Naval Act, work began on the construction of 6 frigates. Some of these names will sound familiar.
No.
The USS United States, the President, the Constellation, the Chesapeake, the Congress, and, my favorite, the Constitution. The Constitution, launched in 1797, the most famous of the 6 was nicknamed Old Ironsides, like the earlier HMS Britannia, and thanks to the efforts of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., is still in existence today, anchored in the Boston Harbor. Now, soon after the bill was passed, Congress authorized $800,000 to obtain a treaty with the Algerians and ransom the captives, triggering an amendment in the act which would halt the construction of the ships if peace was declared. After considerable debate, 3 of the 6 frigates were authorized to be completed: the United States, the Constitution, and the Constellation. However, the first naval vessel to sail was the USS Ganges on May 24, 1798. Now, at the same time, tensions between the U.S. and France developed into a quasi-war, which originated from the Treaty of Alliance in 1778 that had brought the French into the Revolutionary War. The United States preferred to take a position of neutrality in the conflicts between France and Britain, but this put the nation at odds with both the British and the French. After the Jay Treaty was signed in Great Britain in 1794, France began to side against the United States, and by 1797 they had seized over 300 American vessels. Give me back my fishing boat.
What?
Now, the newly inaugurated President John Adams took steps to deal with the crisis, working with Congress to finish the 3 almost working frigates, approving funds to build the other 3, and attempting to negotiate an agreement similar to the Jay Treaty with France. The XYZ affair originated with a report distributed by Adams where alleged French agents were identified by the letters X, Y, and Z, who informed the delegation a bribe must be paid before the diplomats could meet with the foreign minister, and the resulting scandal increased popular support in the country for a war with France. Concern about the War Department's ability to manage the Navy led to the creation of the Department of the Navy, which was established on April 30th, 1798. Now, the war with France was fought almost entirely at sea, mostly between privateers and merchant ships. The first victory for the United States Navy was on July the 7th, 1798, when the USS Delaware captured the French privateer Le Croyable, and the first victory over an enemy warship was February 9th, 1799, when the frigate Constellation captured the French frigate L'Insurgent. By the end of 1800, peace with France had been declared, and in 1801, to prevent a second disarmament of the Navy, the outgoing Federalist administration rushed through Congress an act authorizing a peacetime Navy for the first time, which limited the Navy to 6 active frigates and 7 in ordinary, as well as 45 officers and 150 midshipmen. The remainder of the ships in service were sold, and dismissed officers were given 4 months' pay. Now, the problem with the Barbary States never went away, and on May 10th, 1891, the Tripolians declared war on the United States by chopping down the flag in front of the American embassy, which began the First Barbary War. The USS Philadelphia was captured by the Moors, but then set on fire in an American raid led by Stephen Decatur. The Marines invaded the shores of Tripoli in 1805, captured the city of Derna, the first time the U.S. flag has ever flown on a foreign conquest. This act was enough to induce the Barbary rulers to sign peace treaties. Subsequently, the Navy was greatly reduced for reasons of economy, and instead of regular ships, many gunboats were built intended for coastal use only. This policy proved completely ineffective within a decade.
What?
President Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party opposed a strong navy, arguing that the small gunboats stationed at major Atlantic harbors, part of the first Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton's Revenue Marine, were all the nation needed to defend itself.
Sure.
However, this small fleet of lightly armed revenue cutters, which Hamilton had proposed in the Federalist Papers numbers 11 and 12, were insufficient as a wartime naval force for the needs of the new United States of America. During the French Revolutionary Wars, the Royal Navy had begun to impress sailors from American ships who, they alleged, were British deserters. An estimated 10,000 soldiers were impressed this way between 1799 and 1812. In 1807, the Chesapeake-Leopold affair, HMS Leopold demanded that Chesapeake submit to an inspection for British deserters on board, which was rejected. Leopold responded by opening fire on the Chesapeake and forcibly searched the ship, detaining a number of alleged British subjects. The most violent of many such encounters, the affair furthered the tensions between the two nations, and in June of 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain. Now, much of the war was expected to be fought at sea, and within an hour of the announcement of war, diminutive U.S. Navy set forth to do battle with an opponent outnumbered at 50 to 1. After 2 months, the Constitution sank the HMS Guerrier. Guerrier's crew were most dismayed to see their cannonballs bouncing off the Constitution's unusually strong live oak hull, giving her the endearing nickname of Old Ironsides. On December the 29th, the 1812 Constitution defeated the HMS Java off the coast of Brazil, and the Java was burned after the Americans determined it could not be salvaged. On October the 25th, 1812, the United States captured the HMS Macedonian, and after a battle, Macedonian was captured and entered into the American service. We're going to borrow your ship.
Excuse me.
1813, the USS Essex commenced a very fruitful raiding venture into the South Pacific under the command of David Porter. Preying upon the British merchants and whaling industry, the Essex was already known for the capture of the HMS Alert and the British transport of previous year, and gained further successes, capturing 15 British merchant ships. Your mine, your mine, your mine, your mine. Now, the British finally took action, dispatching the HMS Cherub and the HMS Phoebe to stop the Essex. These two ships, under the command of Sir James Hilliard, blockaded Essex before Porter ordered his ship to attempt to escape. In the ensuing battle, Essex was captured by the British. Now, the capture of the 3 Royal Navy frigates led to the British to deploy more vessels on the American seaboard to tighten their blockade of U.S. ports. On June 1st, 1813, off Boston Harbor, the American frigate Chesapeake, commanded by Captain James Lawrence, was captured by the British frigate HMS Shannon under Captain Sir Philip Broke.
I'm just kidding.
Is the last name, apparently. Lawrence was mortally wounded and famously cried out, "Don't give up the ship!" Despite their earlier successes, by 1814, many of the Navy's best ships were blockaded in port and unable to prevent British incursions on land and via the sea. During the summer of 1814, the British fought the Chesapeake Campaign, which was climaxed by amphibious assaults against Washington and Baltimore. The capital fell to the British almost without a fight, and several American warships were burned at the Washington Navy Yard, including the 44-gun frigate USS Columbia. At Baltimore, the bombardment of Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, and the hulks blocking the channel prevented the fleet from entering the harbor. The Army re-embarked on the ships, ending the battle. Though the American naval victories at the Battle of Lake Champlain and the Battle of Lake Erie halted the final British offensive in the north and helped deny the British exclusive rights to the Great Lakes in the Treaty of Ghent. Shortly before the treaty was signed, President was captured by 4 British frigates, and 3 days after the treaty was signed, the Constitution captured the HMS Levant and Siam. The final naval action of the war occurred almost 5 months after the treaty, when the sloop USS Peacock captured the East India Company brig Nautilus, the last enemy ship captured by the U.S. Navy until World War II. Now, after the war, the Navy's accomplishments paid off in the form of better funding, and it embarked on one of construction of many new ships. However, expensive larger ships was prohibitive, and many of them stayed in shipyards half completed until readiness for another war, until the age of sail had almost completely passed. The main force of the Navy continued to be larger sailing frigates with a number of smaller sloops during the 3 decades of peace. Well, by 1840, the Navy began to adopt steam power and shell guns, but they lagged behind the French and British in adopting the new technologies. Back then, a lot of our ships were all sail-powered. Enlisted sailors during this time included many foreign-born men and native-born Americans who were unusually social outcasts who had few other employment options or were trying to escape punishment for crimes. In 1835, almost 3,000 men sailed with merchant ships out of Boston Harbor, but only 90 men were recruited by the Navy. It was unlawful for black men to serve in the Navy, but the shortage of men was so acute this law was frequently ignored. Now, discipline followed the customs of the Royal Navy, but punishment was much milder than typical by European navies. Sodomy was rarely prosecuted. The Army abolished flogging as a punishment in 1812, but the Navy kept it until 1850.
Well then.
During the War of 1812, the Barbary States took advantage of the weakness of the United States Navy to again capture American merchant ships and sailors. After the Treaty of Ghent was signed, the United States looked at ending the piracy in the Mediterranean, which had plagued the American merchants for 2 decades. On March 3, 1815, Congress authorized the deployment of naval power against Algiers, beginning the Second Barbary War. 2 powerful squadrons under the command of Commodores Decatur and William Bainbridge, including the 74-gun ships of the line Washington, Independence, and Franklin, 3 names you'll hear later as aircraft carriers, were dispatched to the Mediterranean. Shortly after departing Gibraltar en route to Algiers, Decatur's squadron encountered an Algerian flagship, Mashuda, and the action of 17th of June, 1850, captured it. Not long after, the American squadron likewise captured the Algerian brig Estidio in the Battle off Cape Palos. By June, the squadron had reached Algiers and peace negotiated with the Dey, including the return of the captured vessels and men, a guarantee to no further tributes and the right to trade in the region. Basically, if you do this wrong, we're going to come over and kick your butt again.
What?
Well, piracy in the Caribbean were also a major problem between 1850 and 1822. An estimated 3,000 ships were captured by pirates. In 1819, Congress authorized President James Madison to deal with the threat, and since many of the pirates were privateers in the newly independent states of Latin America, they decided to embark on the strategy of diplomacy backed up with the guns of the Navy. An agreement with Venezuela reached in 1819, but ships were still regularly captured until a military campaign by the West India Squadron under the command of David Porter used a combination of large frigates escorting merchant ships backed by many small craft searching small coves and islands and capturing pirate vessels. During this campaign, the USS Seagull became the first steam-powered ship to see combat action. Although isolated instances of piracy continued in the 1830s, by 1826 the frequent attacks had ended and the region was declared free for commerce. Now, another problem international was slave trade, and the African Squadron was formed in 1820 to deal with this threat. Politically, the suppression of the slave trade was unpopular, and the squadron was withdrawn in 1823 to obstinately deal with piracy in the Caribbean, did not return to the African coast until the passage of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Britain in 1842. After this treaty was passed, the United States used fewer ships than the treaty required, ordered the ships based far from the coast of Africa, and used ships that were too large to operate close to shore. Between 1845 and 1850, the United States Navy captured only 10 slave vessels, while the British captured 423 vessels carrying 27,000 slaves. Congress formally authorized the establishment of the United States Military Academy in 1802, but it took almost 50 years to approve a similar school for naval officers. We're going to run a little behind schedule, class. During this long period of peace...
Just make it up as you go.
Exactly. I'm going to guess. During the long period of peace between 1815 and 1846, midshipmen had few opportunities for promotion, and their warrants were often obtained via patronage. The poor quality of officer training soon became visible after the Somers affair, an alleged mutiny aboard the trading ship USS Somers in 1842, and the subsequent execution of midshipman Philip Spencer. George Bancroft, appointed Secretary of the Navy in 1845, decided to work outside of the congressional approval and created a new naval academy for officers. He formed a council led by Commodore Matthew Perry to create a new system for training officers and turned to the old Fort Severn at Annapolis into a new institution, which would be designed for the United States Naval Academy by Congress in 1851. Now, naval forces participated in the effort to forcibly move the Seminole Indians from Florida to a reservation west of the Mississippi. After a massacre of Army soldiers near Tampa in December 28, 1835, Marines and sailors were added to the forces which fought the Second Seminole War from 1836 until 1842. Mosquito Fleet was formed in the Everglades on various small craft to transport a mixture of Army and Navy personnel to pursue the Seminole into the swamps. About 1,500 soldiers were killed during the conflict, and some Seminoles agreed to move, but a small group of Seminoles remained in control of the Everglades and the area around Lake Okeechobee. Well, the Navy played a role in two major operations in the Mexican-American War. During the Battle of Veracruz, it transported an invasion force that captured Veracruz by landing 12,000 troops and the equipment in one day,
Wow.
leading eventually to the capture of Mexico City at the end of the war. The Pacific Squadron ships facilitated the capture of California. And in 1853, Perry led the Perry Expedition, a squadron of 4 ships which sailed to Japan to establish normal relations with Japan. The Perry's 2 technologically advanced steam-powered ships and calm, firm diplomacy convinced Japan to end 3 centuries of isolation and signed the Treaty of Kanawha with the U.S. in 1854. Nominally a treaty of friendship, the agreement soon paved the way for the opening of Japan and formal trade relations with the United States and Europe. Now, next up in our happy search through history, we have the Civil War. Beginning of the war and the end of 1861, 373 commissioned officers, warrant officers, midshipmen resigned or were dismissed from the United States and went on to serve in the Confederacy. In April 20th, 1861, the Union burned its ships that were at the Norfolk Naval Yards to prevent their capture by the Confederates, but not all of these ships were completely destroyed. The screw frigate USS Merrimack was so hastily scuttled that her hull and steam engine were basically intact, which gave the South's Stephen Mallory the idea of raising her and then armoring her upper sides with iron plate. The resulting ship was nicknamed the CSS Virginia. Meanwhile, John Erickson had similar ideas, received funding to build the USS Monitor. Congratulations, we have our new Ironsides. Now, Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the USS Army at the beginning of the war, devised the Anaconda Plan to win the war with as little bloodshed as possible. His idea was that a Union blockade of the main ports would weaken the Confederate economy. Then the capture of the Mississippi River would split the South. Lincoln adopted the plan in terms of a blockade to squeeze to death the Confederate economy, but overruled Scott's warnings that his new army was not ready for an offensive operation because public opinion demanded an immediate attack. Well, on March 8, 1862, the Confederate Navy initiated the first combat between ironclads when the Virginia successfully attacked the blockade. The next day, the Monitor engaged the Virginia in the Battle of the Hampton Roads. The battle would end in a draw, and the Confederacy later lost the Virginia when the ship was scuttled to prevent capture. The Monitor was the prototype for the Monitor warship, and many more were built by the Union Navy. While the Confederacy built more ironclad ships during the war, they lacked the ability to build or purchase ships that they could effectively counter the monitors with. Now, along with the ironclad ships, the new technology of naval mines, which were known as torpedoes after the torpedo eel, and submarine warfare were introduced during the war by the Confederacy. During the Battle of Mobile Bay, mines were used to protect the harbor and sink the Union monitor USS Tecumseh. After the Tecumseh sank, Admiral David Farragut famously said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." The forerunner of modern submarines, the CSS David, attacked the USS New Ironsides using a spar torpedo, kind of like a long javelin. Another submarine, the CSS H.L. Huntley, was designed to dive and surface, but ultimately did not work well and sank on 5 occasions during trials.
Oops.
In action against the USS Housatonic, the submarine successfully sank its target but was lost in the same explosion.
Oops.
Now, Confederates operated a number of commerce raiders and blockade runners, CSS Alabama being the most famous, and British investors bought small, fast blockade runners that traded arms and luxuries brought in from Bermuda, Cuba, and the Bahamas in return for high-priced cotton and tobacco. When the Union Navy seized a blockade runner, the ship and cargo were sold, and the proceeds were given to Navy sailors. The captured crewmen were mostly British and were simply released. Now, the blockade of the South caused the Southern economy to collapse during the war. Shortages of food and supplies were caused by the blockade, the failure of Southern railroads, the loss of control of the main rivers, and the foraging by Union and Confederate armies. The standard of living fell, even as large-scale printing of paper money caused inflation and distrust of currency. By 1864, the internal food distribution had broken down, leaving cities without enough food, causing food riots across the Confederacy. The Union victory at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher in January of 1865 closed the last useful southern port, virtually ending blockade running and hastening the end of the war. Well, from 1865 to 1882, the Navy went into a period of decline. In 1864, the Navy had about 51,500 men and about 700 ships and about 60 modern-type coastal ironclads, which made the U.S. Navy the largest in the world after the Royal Navy. By 1880, though, the Navy was down to 48 ships in its commission and 6,000 men, and the ships and shore facilities were decrepit. But Congress saw no more need to spend money to improve them. The Navy was unprepared to fight a major maritime war before 1897. Well, in 1871, an expedition of 5 warships, commanded by Rear Admiral John Rodgers, was sent to Korea to obtain an apology for the murders of several shipwrecked American sailors and to secure a treaty to protect shipwrecked foreigners in the future. After a small skirmish, Rodgers launched an amphibious assault on approximately 650 men on the forts protecting Seoul. Despite the capture of the forts, the Koreans refused to negotiate, and the expedition was forced to leave before the start of typhoon season. 9 sailors and 6 Marines received medal and honors for their acts of heroism during the Korean campaign, the first for actions of a foreign conflict. And by 1870s, most of the ironclads from the Civil War were laid up in reserves, leaving the United States virtually without an ironclad fleet. When the Virginius affair broke out in 1873, a Spanish ironclad that happened to be anchored in New York Harbor, leading to the uncomfortable realization on the part of the United States Navy that it had no ship capable of defeating such a vessel. The Navy hastily issued contracts for the construction of 5 new ironclads and accelerated the existing repair program for several more. Well, by the time Garfield assumed the presidency in 1881, the Navy's condition had deteriorated still further. A review conducted on behalf of the new Secretary of Navy, William H. Hunt, found that 140 vessels on the Navy's active list, only 52 were in an operational state.
Oops.
Mere 17 were iron-hulled ships, including 14 aging Civil War-era ironclads. You don't let your Navy sit there and rust. Come on, guys.
Nope.
Hunt recognized the need for modernizing the Navy and set up an informal advisory board to make recommendations. Also to be expected, morale was considerably down. Officers and sailors in foreign ports were all too aware that their old wooden ships would not survive long in the event of war. The limitations of the monitor type effectively prevented the United States from projecting power overseas. Until the 1890s, the United States would have come off badly in a conflict with even Spain or a Latin American power. Well, from 1882, they started putting together their plans, recommendations with the panel. Hunt went to Congress and asked for more funds to construct modern ships. The request was initially rejected, but in 1883, Congress authorized the construction of 3 protected cruisers, the USS Chicago, the Boston, and the Atlanta, and the dispatch vessel, the USS Dolphin, together as the ABCD ships. In 1885, 2 more protected cruisers, the USS Charleston and the USS Newark, which was the last American cruiser to be fitted with a sail rig, were authorized. Congress also authorized the construction of the first battleships of the Navy, the USS Texas and the USS Maine. The ABCD ships proved to be excellent vessels, and the 3 cruisers were organized into the Squadron of Evolution, popularly known as the White Squadron, because of the color of their hulls, which had been used to train a generation of officers and men. Before 1910, when the apprenticeship system was established, most enlisted sailors were foreign mercenaries who spoke little English. Now, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, published in 1890, had a momentous impact on the major navies around the globe. In the United States, it justified expansion in both government and the general public. With the closing of the frontier, geographical expansionists had to look outwards to the Caribbean, to Hawaii, to the Pacific, and with the doctrine of the manifest destiny as philosophical justification, many saw the Navy as an essential part of realizing that doctrine beyond the limits of the American continent. In 1890, Mahan's doctrine influenced Navy Secretary Benjamin F. Tracy to propose the United States start building no less than 200 ships of all types. But Congress rejected this proposal. Instead, the Navy Act of 1890 authorized the building of 3 more battleships, USS Indiana, the USS Massachusetts, and the USS Oregon, followed by the USS Iowa. Now, by around the start of the 20th century, 2 Kearsgate-class battleships and 3 Illinois-class battleships were completed or under construction, which brought the U.S. Navy from 12th place to 5th place among the world navies. Now, battle tactics, especially the long-range gunnery, became a central concern. The USS Puritan and the 4 Amphitrite-class monitors, originally ordered after the 1873 Virginia war scare, was completed in the 1880s and 1890s. They were followed by the USS Monterey and the Arkansas-class monitors. All of these vessels, except the Arkansas-class, would later take part in the Spanish-American War in 1898. The development of the modern torpedo in Europe between 1866 and 1890 would also lead the Navy to build 35 steam-powered torpedo boats between 1890 and 1901 for coastal defense. Now, the United States was interested in purchasing colonies from Spain, specifically Cuba, but Spain refused. Newspapers wrote stories, many of which fabricated, about atrocities committed in Spanish colonies, which raised tensions between the 2 countries. A riot gave the United States an excuse to send aid to Cuba, and the subsequent explosion of the ship in the Havana harbor increased popular support for war with Spain. The cause of the explosion was investigated by a board of inquiry, which in May of 1898 came to the conclusion the explosion was caused by a sea mine. There was pressure from the public to blame Spain for the sinking of the ship. However, later investigations pointed to an internal explosion from one of the magazines caused by heat from a fire in the adjacent coal bunker. Now, Assistant Navy Secretary Theodore Roosevelt quietly positioned the Navy for an attack before the Spanish-American War was declared in April of 1898. The Asiatic Squadron, under the command of George Dewey, immediately left Hong Kong for the Philippines, attacking and decisively defeating the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay. A few weeks later, the North Atlantic Squadron destroyed the majority of heavy Spanish naval units in the Caribbean in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Now, the Navy's experience in this war was encouraging that it had won, but also cautionary, as the enemy had one of the weakest of the world's modern fleets. Also, the Manila Bay attack was extremely risky, which the American ships could have incurred severe damage or run out of supplies, as they were 7,000 miles from the nearest American harbor. That would have had a profound effect on Navy strategy and American foreign policy for the next several decades. Well, fortunately for the new Navy, as most ardent political supporter Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901, under his administration, the Navy went from the sixth largest in the world to the second only to the Royal Navy. Now, Theodore Roosevelt's administration became involved in the politics of the Caribbean and Central America with interventions in 1901, 02, 03, and 06. In a speech in 1901, who hasn't heard this, Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far," which was the cornerstone of diplomacy during his presidency. Roosevelt believed that the U.S.-controlled canal across Central America was of vital strategic interest in the United States Navy because it would significantly shorten travel times for ships between the two coasts. Roosevelt was able to reverse a direction in favor of the Nicaraguan Canal and instead moved the purchase to the failed French effort across the Isthmus of Panama. The isthmus was controlled by Colombia, and in early 1903 the Hay-Herran Treaty was signed by both nations to give control of the canal to the United States. After the Colombian Senate failed to ratify the treaty, Roosevelt implied to the Panamanian rebels that if they revolted, the United States Navy would assist their cause for independence. Panama proceeded to proclaim its independence on November 3, 1903, and the USS Nashville impeded any interference from Colombia. The victorious Panamanians allowed the United States control of the Panama Canal Zone on February 23, 1904, for $10 million of U.S. dollars. The naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, was also built in 1905 to protect the canal. Now, the latest technological innovation at the time, submarines, was developed in the state of New Jersey by an Irish-American inventor, John Philip Holland. His submarine, the USS Holland, was officially commissioned into the United States service in the fall of 1900. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 and the launching of the HMS Dreadnought in the following year left impetus on the construction program. At the end of 1907, Roosevelt had 16 new pre-Dreadnought battleships to make up his Great White Fleet, which he sent on a cruise around the world. While normally peaceful and a valuable training exercise for the rapidly expanding Navy, it was also a useful political demonstration for the United States' power and capabilities. At every port, the politicians and naval officers of both potential allies and enemies were welcomed on board and given tours. The cruise had the desired effect, and American power was subsequently taken more seriously. Now, the voyage taught the Navy that more fueling stations were needed around the world, and the strategic potential of the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914. The Great White Fleet required almost 50 coaling ships, and during the cruise, most of the fleet's coal were purchased from the British, who could deny access to fuel during a military crisis, as they did with Russia during the Russo-Japanese War. Well, World War I would come along, 1914. The United States wouldn't enter until 1916, but they did learn, the United States discovered that Mexico, Germans had a merchant ship, Prego, was carrying illegal arms to Mexico. President Wilson ordered the Navy to stop the ship from docking at a port in Veracruz. On April 21, 1914, a naval infantry brigade of 2,500 seamen, along with 1,300 men from the Marine Corps, occupied Veracruz. During the battle, the naval brigade, which used outdated massed infantry tactics, proved less of an adept at urban combat than the Marine Brigade, which had embraced the small unit tactics. Thus, combined with the unacceptability of risking increasingly valuable naval technical specialists on ground combat, resulted in Veracruz being the last large-scale use of U.S. soldiers as landing infantry, leaving the Marine Corps to conduct amphibious assaults. Guess what, Marines? You now have a job.
What?
Total of 55 medals of honor were awarded for acts of heroism at the Veracruz, the largest number ever granted for a single action. Well, despite the U.S. declaration of neutrality and the German accountability for its unrestricted submarine warfare, in 1915 the British passenger liner Lusitania was sunk, leading to calls for war. President Wilson forced the Germans to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare, and after a long debate, Congress passed the Naval Act of 1916 that authorized $500 million construction program for 3 years for 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 10 scout cruisers, 50 destroyers, and 67 submarines. That's a lot of ships.
A lot of ships.
The idea was a balanced fleet, but in the event that destroyers were much more important because they had to handle submarines and convoys. By the end of the war, 273 destroyers had been ordered. Most were finished after World War I ended, but many served in World War II. There were few war plans beyond the defense of the main American harbors. Now, Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels, a pacifistic journalist, had built up the educational resources of the Navy and made its Naval War College an essential experience for many would-be admirals. However, he alienated the officer corps with his moralistic reforms. No wine in the officers' mess, no hazing in Annapolis, more chaplains in the YMCAs. Ignoring the nation's strategic needs and disdaining the advice of its experts, Daniels suspended meetings of the Joint Army and Navy Board for 2 years because it was giving unwelcome advice. He chopped in half the General Board's recommendations for new ships, reducing the authority of officers at the naval yards where ships were being built and repaired, and ignored the administrative chaos in his department. Sounds like the guy was trying to destroy his own navy.
It does sound kind of that way.
Bradley Fisk, one of the most innovative admirals in American naval history, was Daniels' top aide in 1914. He recommended a reorganization that would prepare for war, but Daniels refused. Instead, he replaced Fisk in 1915 and brought in for a new chief of naval operations an unknown Captain William S. Benson. Chosen for his compliance, Benson proved a wily bureaucrat who was more interested in preparing for an eventual showdown with Britain than an immediate one with Germany. In 1915, Daniels set up the Naval Consulting Board, headed by Thomas Edison, to obtain the advice and expertise of leading scientists, engineers, and industrialists. It popularized technology, naval expansion, military preparedness, and was well covered in the media. Daniels and Benson rejected the proposal to send observers to Europe, leaving the Navy in the dark about the success of the German submarine campaign. Admiral William Sims charged after the war in 1817 only 10% of the Navy's warships were fully manned. The rest lacked 43% of their seamen. Of only a third of the ships that were fully ready, large anti-submarine ships were few in number, as if no one noticed the U-boat factor had been a focus of foreign policy for 2 years. The U.S. Navy's only warfighting plan, the Black Plan, assumed the Royal Navy did not exist and that the German battleships were moving freely about the Atlantic and the Caribbean and threatening the Panama Canal. His most recent biographer concludes that it is true that Daniels had not prepared the Navy for the war that it would have to fight. Now, by the time the war finally came to the U.S., late in the war, President Wilson ordered the United States Marine Corps enlist strengthened March 26th, and the United States Naval Academy class of 1917 graduated 3 months early before America entered the war in April 1917. Retired officers were recalled to active duty at shore-stationed billets, freeing younger officers for sea duty. The Navy was given control of the Coast Guard, and the naval militia of 584 officers and almost 8,000 men were assigned to coast patrol services in the Naval Reserve Flying Corps. The Navy took possession of the United States wireless stations and dismantled those less useful locations to salvage equipment for military use. The Navy's role was mostly limited to convoy escorts and troop transports and laying the North Sea mine barrage. The first United States military unit sent to Europe was the 1st Aeronautic detachment of 7 naval officers and 122 enlisted men who arrived in France to form the Northern Bombing Group. The United States Navy sent a battleship group to Scapa Flow to join the British Grand Fleet, destroyers to Queenstown, Ireland, and submarines to help guard convoys. Several regiments of Marines were also dispatched to France, and the first victory for the Navy of the war was November 17, 1917, when the USS Fanning and the USS Nicholson sank the German U-boat U-58. During World War I, the Navy was the first branch of the United States Armed Forces to allow enlistment by women to a non-nursing capacity as Yeoman F. The first woman to enlist in the U.S. Navy was Loretta Perfectus Walsh, March 17, 1917. Now, the Navy's vast wartime expansion was overseen by civilian officials, especially Assistant Secretary FDR. In peacetime, the Navy confined all munitions that lacked civilian uses, including warships, naval guns, and shells, to the naval yards. The Navy yards expanded enormously, and subcontracted the shells and explosives to chemical companies like DuPont and Hercules. Items available on the civilian market, such as food and uniforms, were always purchased from civilian contractors. Armor plate and airplanes were purchased on the market. Now, after World War I, the United States Navy had almost 500,000 officers and enlisted men and women. In terms of personnel, was the largest in the world. Younger officers were enthusiastic about the potential of land-based naval aviation, as well as the potential roles of aircraft carriers. Chief of Naval Operations Benson was not among them. He tried to abolish aviation in 1919 because he could not conceive of any use the fleet would ever have for aviation. They were really thinking ahead, weren't they?
They were.
However, Roosevelt listened to his visionaries and reversed Benson's decision. After a short period of demobilization, the major naval aviations of the globe began programs to increasing the size and number of their capital ships. Wilson's plan for a world-leading set of capital ships led to a Japanese counter-program and a plan by the British to build sufficient ships to maintain a navy superior to either. American isolationist feeling and the economic concerns of the others led to the Washington Naval Conference of 1921. The outcome of the conference included the Washington Naval Treaty, known as the Five-Power Treaty, and limitations on the use of submarines. The treaty prescribed a ratio of 5-5-3-1-1 for capital ships between treaty nations. The treaty recognized the U.S. Navy as being equal to the Royal Navy for 525,000 tons of capital ships and 135,000 tons of aircraft carriers, and the Japanese as the third power. Many older ships were scrapped in favor of the new nations to meet the treaty limitations, and the new building of capital ships limited. Now, one consequence was the encouragement and development of light cruisers and aircraft carriers. The United States' first carrier, a converted collier named USS Langley, was commissioned in 1922, soon joined by the USS Lexington and the USS Saratoga, which had been designed as battle cruisers until the treaty forbade it. Organizationally, the Bureau of Aeronautics was formed in 1921. Naval aviators would soon be referred to as members of the United States Naval Air Corps. Now, Army Airman Billy Mitchell challenged the Navy by trying to demonstrate that warships could be destroyed by land-based bombers. He destroyed his career in 1925 by publicly attacking senior leaders of the Army and Navy for incompetence for their almost treasonous administration of the national defense. Chief of Naval Operations William V. Pratt agreed with President Hoover's emphasis on disarmament and went along with the postponement of new construction and cutting the fleet. Other naval policies disagreed sharply with Hoover's policies. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been in fact of civilian control of the Navy during World War I, knew many senior officers, and strongly supported naval expansion. The Invention Travel Act of 1934 set up a regular program of shipbuilding and modernization to bring the Navy to the maximum size allowed by treaty. The Navy's preparation helped along by the Navy Assistant Secretary turned President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The naval limitation treaties also applied to bases, but Congress only approved building seaplane bases on Wake Island, Midway Island, and Dutch Harbor, and rejected any other funds for Guam or the Philippines. Navy ships were designed with greater endurance and range that allowed them to be operated further from bases and between refits. Now, the Navy had a presence in the Far East with a naval base on U.S.-owned Philippines and river gunboats in China on the Yangtze River. The gunboat USS Panay was bombed and machine gunned by Japanese airplanes. Washington quickly accepted Japan's apologies and compensation. African Americans were enlisted during World War I, but this was halted in 1919, and they were mustered out of the Navy. Starting in the 1930s, a few were recruited to serve as stewards on the officers' mess. African Americans were recruited in larger numbers only after Roosevelt insisted in 1942. Now, the Naval Act of 1936 authorized the first new battleship since 1921, the USS North Carolina, and laid down in October of 1937. The Second Vincent Act authorized a 20% increase in the size of the Navy, and in June of 1940, the Two Ocean Navy Act authorized an 11% expansion of the Navy. Chief of Naval Operations Harold Ransford Stark asked for another 70% increase, amounting to about 200 additional ships, which was authorized by Congress less than a month. In September of 1940, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement gave Britain much-needed destroyers of World War I vintage in exchange for the United States' use of British bases. Well, in 1941, the Atlantic Fleet was reactivated. The Navy's first shot in anger came on April 9th when the destroyer USS Niblack dropped depth charges on a U-boat detected while Niblack was rescuing survivors from a torpedoed Dutch freighter. In October, the destroyers Kearney and Reuben James were torpedoed, and the Reuben James was lost. Now, submarines were the silent service in terms of operating characteristics and their closed-mouth preferences for the submariners. Strategists had, however, been looking into this new type of warship, influenced in large part by Germany's early successful U-boat campaigns. As early as 1912, Chester Nimitz had argued for long-range submarines to accompany the fleet to scout for enemy's locations. The new head of the submarine section in 1919 was Captain Thomas Hart, who argued that submarines could win the next war. There's no quicker, no more effective way of defeating Japan than the cutting over sea communications. However, Hart was astonished to discover how backward American submarines were compared to the captured German U-boats and how unready they were for their mission. The public supported submarines for their coastal protection mission. They would presumably intercept enemy fleets approaching San Francisco or New York. The Navy realized it was a mission that isolationists in Congress would fund, but it was not actually serious. Old line admirals said the mission of the subs ought to be in the eyes of the battle fleet and its assistance in battle. This was unfeasible since even on the surface, submarines could move no more than 20 knots, far slower than the 30-knot main warships. Young commanders were organized into a submarine officers' conference in 1926. They argued that they were the best suited for the commerce rating that had been the forte of the U-boats. They therefore redesigned their new boats along German lines and added a new requirement that they were capable of sailing alone for 7,500 miles on a 75-day mission. Unrestricted submarine warfare had led to war with Germany in 1917 and was still vigorously condemned by both public opinion and by treaties, including the London Treaty of 1930. Nevertheless, these submariners planned as a role of unrestricted warfare against Japanese merchant ships, transports, and oil tankers. Navy kept these plans secret from civilians. It was an admiral, not President Roosevelt, who within hours of Pearl Harbor attack ordered unrestricted warfare against any enemy ship anywhere in the Pacific. The submariners had won over Navy strategists, but their equipment was not yet capable of handling the secret mission. The challenge of designing appropriate new boats had been a high priority in 1934, solved in 1936 when the first long-range, all-welded submarines were launched. Even better were the S-class Salmon class, launched in 1937, and the successors, the T-class or Tambor submarines in 1939, and the Gato class in 1940. The new models cost about $5 to $6 million each. At 300 feet in length and 1,500 tons, they are twice as big as the German U-boats, but still highly maneuverable. In only 35 seconds, they could crash dive 60 feet, and the superb Mark III TDC torpedo data computer, an analog computer, took data from the periscope or sonar readings of the target's bearing, range, and angle on the bow, and continuously set the course in proper gyroscope angle for a salvo of torpedoes until the moment of firing. 6 forward tubes and 4 aft were ready for the 24 Mk-14 Fish the subs carried. Cruising on the surface at 20 knots using 4 diesel engines or maneuvering underwater at 8 to 10 knots using battery-powered electric motors, they could circle around slow-moving merchant ships. New steels and welding techniques strengthened the hulls, enabling the subs to dive as deep as 400 feet in order to avoid depth charges.
Ooh.
Expecting long cruisers, the 65 crewmen enjoyed good living conditions, complete with frozen steaks and air conditioning, to handle the hot waters of the Pacific. The new subs could remain at sea for 75 days, cover 10,000 miles without resupplying. The submariners thought that they were ready, but they had 2 hidden flaws. Penny-pinching atmosphere of the 1930s produced hypercautious commanders and defective torpedoes, both that have to be replaced during World War II. Now, World War II, a lot of what our Navy went through in the Pacific was pretty straightforward. When we got hit by Japan, a lot of our early stuff, we were pretty much caught surprised. We had no idea what they had for ability to fire torpedoes. We were looking at the depth of Pearl Harbor, and the number of our ships bought it, just off the basis that we did not expect what happened. We were able to start, fighting back by the time the second wave came through, but the damage was already done. We lost a number of battleships. The Arizona is still sitting at the bottom, leaking oil. But we also learned a couple really neat tricks. We learned how to raise some of our ships. And almost immediately, before that first month was out, we were already working on ways to bring the ships back up and patch them and get them back into play. Or salvage off, guns and stuff so that we could take and bring the fight back to Japan. Now, there were a number of battles that would happen during World War II, but the one key thing that also was really surprising, and a lot of this is where we were able to basically outproduce any country in the world, because that's how good of an industry the United States had. We were literally able to punch out a new aircraft carrier in like a week. We were putting out fighters at an exorbitant rate. We were able to get battleships, but the big thing that we discovered is that, for all the talent and the power of a battleship, they lacked sorely when it came to how aircraft carriers could work. The aircraft carrier advantage is that it used fighter power. It could go out and seek out ships, and depending on your payload, torpedoes, great, bombs, wreck the heck out of somebody's runway, or with machine guns you could attack targets that are on the ground. You had escorts from your transport ships that were able to help the Marines make landings on different places like Guadalcanal. Eventually, one of the great things that they did with our Navy was what was known as the island hopping campaign. They were able to take and cut off bases, and all of a sudden the Japanese would find themselves going, we're out of food. What are we going to do here? And it got really ugly for the Japanese because, what was at first a great expansion, all of a sudden they were stuck with no supplies and some really unhappy island inhabitants. In fact, what was really crazy is the Japanese had one base. We didn't destroy it, a volcano did. So, it's just kind of the way that the fates would work for us, is that where we could lose ships, we were able to, bring other ships back into play. I remember when we lost, I think it was the Yorktown at Midway, less than a week later, we were able to put out another aircraft carrier. Japan, meanwhile, who had lost 4 carriers, they were already struggling just to replace one. In fact, they wound up taking one battleship, and they were looking at the idea of converting it. They would never have gotten their battles. They never would have gotten an aircraft carrier done before 1945. And that's when the war ended. But as our Navy goes, it proved to be very critical, not only in the Pacific theater, but also in the Atlantic when we landed on D-Day, and we were able to bring some of our ships in for fire support. And then, likewise, in the Cold War, some of the ships that were no longer, deemed able to be used in our Navy, they would also be used for scientific purposes in testing the atomic bombs in places like Castle Bravo and stuff. But yes, of course, that's when we also discovered that some of these boats, when they get irradiated, they are a pain to clean up. Some of them we just wound up sinking them and turning them into reef. But yeah, happy birthday to the Navy. After all these years, you guys are still patrolling our harbors, keeping our sea lanes safe. And this has been the Mud Files, and we'll see you guys next week.
Oh.